NBA salary cap expert for the thirdapron.com, is going to help us see the sun with De'Aaron Fox now gone. Yossi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Allen.
Let's start here, Yossi. From a financial standpoint, does it feel like the Kings are in a better position post De'Aaron Fox trade, the same position, or maybe even worse?
I think short term they're worse because they traded Fox, who's on a max contract but a smaller tier one, for Levine, who's making much more. So in the short term, not so great. They didn't really open up that much more flexibility. They have a little bit more space below the tax, so they could still do something else ahead of the trade deadline where they maybe bring in another high paid player, but they didn't get that much flexibility. Now, on the other side, with Fox not wanting to extend or whatever it is, they don't have to give him a max contract anymore, which would be much more than whatever Zach LaVine's getting right now and what he'll probably get on his next deal. So right now LaVine's making mid 40s. I think next year it'll get to like closer to 50 million, and then he's got a player option. So something I'm keeping in the back of my mind is maybe this summer he'll be extension eligible. Maybe he takes a deal like what Rudy Gobert just did, declines that player option, get something cheaper, but then you add more years onto it. So he's still making more money, but he's helping out the Kings in the short term. So that's really the thing. Like short term, I don't think they really got any really good flexibility, but if he does that type of extension, then it makes a lot more sense for the Kings.
Talking to Yossi Gozlan, NBA salary cap expert for the thirdapron.com. Yossi, can you explain, because I was trying to figure this out, right? Because the whole time it was keep Kevin Huerter keep Kevin Huerter because of his salary, to be able to match that for a Cam Johnson deal, something like that. Can you explain the Kings' willingness to part with Kevin Huerter and how that connects to the 16 million traded player exception that they now have, and why they felt like they could move on for Kevin and not lose too much?
So I think the main reason they moved on from Kevin was mainly they wanted to get off his money for next year, but then also they're trading Fox for a more expensive player in Levine. He makes like 10 million more than Fox, so they had to include a little bit more to make the money work. But but then they structured it in a way where it's like two separate trades. They're trading Fox and Jordan McLaughlin for Levine. That works. So then they're essentially trading Kevin Huerter for nothing. So that's why they have a $16 million trade exception. Now, it's also worth noting that they've had several other exceptions. They have like these other trade exceptions that are worth around like 5 million each, about 3 of them.
Right.
And they still have the full mid-level exception. That's worth 12.8 million. They could use that also as a trade exception before the trade deadline. So they can use those exceptions, but realistically, most of them are going to go expired because it's just unlikely that they're going to use all of them. It would take them well into the tax, and they're not going to want to be taxpayers this year, probably not even next year, unless they're really a true contender. But as far as what they can do next, yeah, you can't use any of those exceptions to get a Cam Johnson or a John Collins. They're too short. They need you need an exception at that player salary or more to absorb him in.
Got it.
But they could still do something, maybe with DeRozan, or maybe a combination of Trey Lyles and Devin Carter to try to bring in one of those guys. The math might not be totally sound on there. I'm just saying a couple things, but yeah, at this point, if they're going to bring in a Cam Johnson or a John Collins, one of those other guys they've been linked to, it'll probably have to involve DeRozan at this point.
Wow. Talking to Yossi Gozlan, NBA salary cap expert for the thirdapron.com. Yossi, based on the Kings' finances, how can they approach the buyout market and some of the players that might be available there?
They've always been able to sign all the players, so they saved some money, but they were already below the first apron, which is the threshold. Team, as long as you're below that, you can sign any player that had a high salary above the mid-level exception. So they'll be in a position to go after any player that gets waived. It'll be mostly just a matter of, is there an interest from these players to join the Kings?
Talking to Yossi Gozlan, NBA salary cap expert for the third apron.com. Yossi, how do you view the willingness for certain teams to go into the luxury tax? A lot of times we hear fans say, Vivek needs to go into the luxury tax. And kind of how I've broken it down is, well, a lot of these teams that go into the luxury tax, they're going into the luxury tax because they think they have a championship pedigree team, right? Or they feel like they're a step away, and going into the luxury tax can get them there. You don't really go into the luxury tax to hopefully get to the second round. That might happen, but that's not your intention. How do you view whether or not certain teams should go into the luxury tax and when it's that time to have that conversation?
So aside from the money mainly just being ownership's money, there is a little bit of other negative kind of penalties of being in the tax, mainly that if you're in the tax for like 3 consecutive years, then if you're in the tax again, you have to pay higher rates. And then that makes team building in the future more difficult. So it's called resetting your repeater clock. If you're in the tax, then that counts towards that repeater clock. So ideally, if you can avoid the tax, you do it. So that way, in case you do have to go into the tax in the future, you're less likely to have to be in the repeater. But I think the way you asked me is how I feel about whether teams should go into the tax round, what it takes. That might start to change a little bit, because next year there's going to be a big change to the luxury tax system. It's from the new CBA, but they've just been slowly implementing these changes where it's going to be way more expensive to be in the tax. Once you're like 11 million or so into it, the rates are going to go up more. But on the other side of that, they're going to make it cheaper for teams to be in the tax like within the first 10, 11 million. And I think the idea behind that is to try to motivate teams like the Kings, who are typically never paying tax. I don't think they pay tax since like 2006, to potentially be willing to have their payroll like just high enough where they want to pay some tax, because it'll be like dollar for dollar for the most part. And it's actually something I wrote about on Third Apron. But on the other side of that, it might not only keep teams like the Kings, the Pacers, all these teams that never pay tax to continue not paying tax, but it just might get teams that usually pay a lot of tax, like the Warriors, the Clippers, the Nets, to just pay less, because they've been spending like hundreds of $1 million in the tax over these past few years. They're probably going to want to kind of keep it at a certain level now that's less, because they're higher rates, because of these second apron penalties. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell when a team should be paying tax now at this point. I get the feeling, though, for a team like the Kings that are just now fighting to make the playoffs, they're probably going to be operating with that tax being more or less the threshold they're not going to want to pass for now and maybe the next few years.
Yossi, as we approach the trade deadline in a couple days, from a financial standpoint, where do you think the game of chicken will break, right? Who breaks first in a lot of these situations as the trade deadline approaches? The buyers or the sellers? Will it be the Nets saying, fine, we don't want to, and I keep saying the Wizards kind of messed up with Kyle Kuzma last season, and they could have sold higher on Kyle Kuzma. We don't want to be in that situation. Or is it going to be a Kings team or a Warriors team that's desperate and says, fine, we'll give you more? How do you see this whole thing shaking out, and who breaks first before the trade deadline in most of these situations?
Every trade deadline is different, and I think we've already seen the 2 biggest moves happen, and I think it's a buyer's market where you saw the Lakers, they didn't even give up the whole boat to get Luka. They kept one of their first-round picks. They kept Dalton Knecht. They kept Austin Reeves. And unfortunately with the Kings, I don't think they really got any good value. Like the most valuable first-round pick they got, I think, is the Wolves pick. It seems like this is kind of like a free agent signing all in, but it's like cloaked as a trade, because all the picks the Kings got, unfortunately, they're not really a value. Some of them are going to just be second-round picks. The main thing they got is Zach LaVine to help try to stay competitive now. So that's another example where it seems like the Spurs, they held their ground. They said, hey, we can just sign Fox outright in 2026. Here's our offer. take it, or it potentially might be less in the off season. So I would say right now it's kind of the sellers that are probably the ones uh, that are like, in a worse position in these negotiations.
Well, I think that does help for the Sacramento Kings if they do want to be in on Cam Johnson and some of the situations. Yossi, thank you so much for joining us. Yossi Gozlan, NBA salary cap expert for the thirdapron.com. Go check out all of his work that he mentioned and all the other stuff he has coming up, because a lot is going to happen within these next couple of days. Yossi, thank you so much. We will do it again very soon.
Thanks for having me on, Alan.
Great stuff there. Very eye-opening from Yossi for me to come out and say, are the Kings in a better or worse position? Honestly, Kyle, I thought